welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share stories where people encountered a dogman. These stories include a young man who had an encounter with one of these beings while on a trip with his friends in the mountains of North Carolina, a man who saw one of these creatures while driving back in the 80s, and a couple who had a wolf-like creature jump in front of their car one night. But first, we start with a story about a family who has had an unusual relationship with dogmen for generations. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a poster who details a long-running relationship between his family and dogmen. I've heard of this type of thing before, but this is the first time I've heard it happening with dogmen. It is a very interesting story to say the least, and I thought it was worth sharing. The original poster, or OP, says his family has an unusual relationship with the dogmen in the southeastern region of the United States. Although he grew up in Maryland, his family originates from Cuba. They came to the US in 1898 and became carnival performers. Beginning in Louisiana, they traveled throughout the South, performing and working on old plantations and farms. During this time, the OP's great-great-grandfather came into contact with a local Native American tribe, and shortly thereafter, they started having contact with dogmen. His grandfather, who traveled with the carnival while it was still active, talked about seeing the creatures walking around their camps at night. Although he suffered from dementia, he had a lot of stories about his encounters with the dogmen, with some of them needing to be taken with a grain of salt according to the original poster. The OP's father also had an experience with the dogmen while installing telephone poles as part of his job. He saw 3 dogmen running alongside his truck, staring at him through the truck's windows. This happened to him while he was doing maintenance on Gambrel Mountain in Maryland. As for the OP, he is an avid hunter in the mountains around his home, and every time he goes out, he sees one. The dogmen he sees while out hunting are usually off in the distance or just walking around the riverbanks drinking water. He posted his story online, curious to see if anyone else has similar stories or can explain why the dogmen seem to be following his family. He ends his post saying he has heard they can get violent if provoked, but he has yet to see them hurt anyone or anything. This story reminds me of many I've heard where a person and/or their family have had relationships with Sasquatch for generations. However, as I mentioned before, the account given to us by this poster is the first I've heard involving dogmen. I've often wondered how these relationships begin, with both sides entering into some sort of unspoken agreement to live peacefully while interacting in some way or another. Now, I do say peacefully, but I've heard way too many stories where these things can turn very bad for the people involved in these types of relationships with these beings. Just like with the Sasquatches, dogmen seem to be very drawn to humans. They are often seen observing us and even looking into homes on some occasions. It's like they have a weird fascination with us. Perhaps something attracted the dogmen to the OP's family. Just like with the paranormal involving spirits, demons, or what have you, cryptids sometimes attach themselves to people. This might have happened to one of his ancestors. Or maybe they just started gifting with them at one point. Whatever the case may be, I would not fully trust these creatures, no matter how good the relationship may seem. What do you think about this one? Would you trust cryptids if your family had a long-running relationship with them? And would you try to continue that relationship? The next story comes from a young man who took to the internet to share his encounter with what he believes was a dogman. His experience happened in the North Carolina mountains while he was on a trip with his friends. The original poster took to the online community to share an experience that happened to him a couple of years ago. He was 17 years old at the time. He and 3 of his friends were at a cabin in the mountains of North Carolina, a trip to celebrate the end of their junior year in high school. Their first night there, they heard some noises outside the cabin. This occurred at approximately 1:30 a.m. When they went and looked, they saw nothing. The next morning, they found unusual footprints around the outside of the cabin. The OP says here they were unlike anything he has ever seen before and hopes he never sees anything like them again. A few nights later, they decided to have a campfire. During the night, they were having fun, laughing and joking around as teenagers do when they started hearing growling coming from the woods. Then the OP and his friends saw movement in the shrubbery and smaller plants around them. The plants began moving even though there was no wind. That's when the OP turned around and saw two amber eyes staring at him. His friend, who also saw them, turned to him as the color drained out of his face, asking, "What is that thing?" He describes this thing as being massive and didn't want to find out exactly what it was, so he and his friend took off running for the cabin, heading inside and telling their other two friends what they had just seen. Their friends didn't believe them at first, that is, until they looked outside and saw the creature standing there. It was around 9.5 feet tall and had grayish black hair, huge claws, and fangs. Later that night, the OP looked out his bedroom window to see this thing still standing there, and it was staring directly at him. Regardless to say, he didn't sleep that night, and the memory of the Dogman still haunts him to this day. He and his friends woke up and packed their belongings and went home the next morning. Before posting his story online, he hadn't shared it with anyone because he didn't think anyone would believe him. If I saw glowing amber eyes in the darkness beyond the light of my campfire, I don't think I would stick around to get a closer look either. The OP and his friend did the right thing getting out of there. The only thing I wouldn't have done, no matter how badly I had wanted to, is run from whatever was out there. Now that's easy for me to sit here in my home behind a computer and say, as I don't know how exactly I would react in a situation like that. That said though, it's often said that it's best not to run from cryptids as this typically leads them to giving chase. I will say though that running is the natural inclination when faced with a situation like this, so I can't blame the two boys for doing what they did. Also, for whatever reason, cryptids don't always chase people when they run, but I don't think I would want to try that theory out. Then for the boys to look outside and see a monstrous creature standing there, and for it to stick around all night, this thing, in my opinion, wanted to be seen. I've heard stories where dogmen especially get a sinister delight in provoking fear in people, and this seems to be the case in this story. As for him thinking this was a dogman, I definitely agree based on the description he gives and how this creature acted. Also, there is the growling he and his friends heard coming from the trees. That's very common in dogman encounters. The amber-colored eyes are as well. I see this a lot in stories, as well as them having red eyes. I don't think any of us can blame them for packing up the next day and heading home. I can say for certain I wouldn't want to hang around if something like that was around my campsite and/or cabin either. What would you have done if you saw amber eyes looking at you from the darkness, and then to look out to see something like that standing there out in the open? Is it safe to say you would have gone home the next day too? The next story comes from a poster who had a dogman encounter in a residential neighborhood in Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. Located on the shore of Lake Ontario, Mississauga is the 7th largest city population-wise in Canada and neighbors Toronto. It has a population of 717,961 residents, which is second only to Toronto in Ontario. The residential area where the original poster had his encounter is known as Sherwood Forest, which is located in the southern part of the city. He was 18 years old at the time of the events, which transpired 40 years prior to him posting his story online. The original poster was driving through the Sherwood Forest area with his sister when they turned into a building that is now an old folks' home. They were following the circular driveway around when he noticed an enormous wolf head and shoulders on the side of the drive where there was a forest. He says it looked like a timber wolf, but this thing was much larger. He slowly drove by this creature as close as 10 feet, never taking his eyes off of this thing. The creature did not see the OP because it was instead looking at a barking dog in a nearby backyard. This thing's tongue was hanging out of the left side of its mouth and it was breathing heavily. His sister also saw the wolf head, which scared her to the point that she was crying. When he asked her to describe it, she described exactly what he had seen. When the events of his encounter took place, the OP had no idea what he was looking at. But 3 years before he posted his story online, he came across a famous YouTube channel that shares Dogman stories and knew that's exactly what he had seen that day. Even before he had his encounter, when he was riding the bus to and from school when he was younger, he always felt like there was something off about the forested area where he saw this creature that day. He ends his post by saying he will never forget what he saw and that it was a living, breathing animal, only enormous in size. This isn't the first Dogman story I've heard where it happens in the middle of a big city or in a residential neighborhood. When we think of cryptid encounters, we usually think of them happening out in the middle of nowhere, but every so often I come across a story where one occurs in the middle of a heavily populated city. I will say, upon looking at a map of Mississauga and the surrounding area, there is a nearby golf course with a large natural area, so perhaps the Dogman came from there. However, I will add that it would have had to move through quite a bit of city to reach where the OP and his sister saw it. It really makes you wonder when sightings do occur in big cities, how more people don't see them. But we are talking about creatures that have mastered stealth. That had to be terrifying to look over and see a giant wolf head sticking out of the foliage like that. Like so many before him, the OP thought he was looking at a wolf, but describes it as being much larger. And being that this story took place 40 years ago, which would put it in the early 80s, no one had heard of a Dogman back then. Now I will say that sightings do date back before this time period, and I have done stories on some much earlier than the 80s, but the term Dogman had not yet been coined. On that note, I'm always interested to see a sighting or encounter from a long time ago, especially with a Dogman or another type of cryptid other than a Sasquatch. Dogman seems to be thought of as a more recent phenomenon, but has actually been seen for decades, if not longer. What do you think about this sighting from the 80s? And also about Dogmen being seen in residential neighborhoods? The final story of this episode comes from a poster who relays the tale of his cousin's encounter with a dog-like creature while driving one night. This story also takes place in Ontario, Canada, but the original poster does not say where in Ontario his cousin had the misfortune of laying eyes on one of these beings. A couple of years before taking to the internet to post the story, the original poster's cousin and her husband had an encounter in his hometown, which he wishes to keep private. The incident took place in the Niagara region of Ontario, near a small border town which is quite populated. The couple was driving back from a family function when they saw a wolf-like creature jump across the road in front of them. It was summertime and there was a full moon that night, which gave them a good look at this thing. It had a wolf's head, yellow eyes, and a bulky body. It stopped in the middle of the road, looked at them, and then jumped the rest of the way across with ease. The OP's cousin and her husband were very rational people who believe in science and have no interest in the supernatural. They believe everything has an explanation. The OP says they admitted that they would not have shared their experience if they hadn't seen it together because it seemed too unbelievable to be true. They don't usually make up stories, especially regarding something like this. they also have nothing to gain by making something like this up. I'll agree they have nothing to gain by sharing their story, as telling people about stuff like this usually brings negative attention and/or disbelief, and sometimes even mockery or ridicule. Most people describe others looking at them like they are crazy when they talk about their encounters. Even with more and more people sharing their encounter stories and the cryptid topic becoming less of a stigma, people are still less accepting of not just stories, but believing that these creatures actually exist. I mean, they are beings straight out of legend, lore, fairy tales, and nightmares, but with more encounters being reported and posted online seemingly every single day, the evidence is starting to add up. I know a lot of people want picture and/or video proof, and they want to say the stories are fake without it, but it would take a lot of time and effort on a grand scale to coordinate that many fake stories coming in from all over the world. In any case, I couldn't imagine seeing something like this while driving at night, much less having it jump in front of my car, and to have it stop and look at them. That had to be terrifying to have something straight out of mythology make eye contact with you like that. I think I would have been driving a little faster the rest of the way home. What do you think about this one? What would you have done if something like that jumped in front of your car? I think it's safe to assume that you probably would have driven a little faster on the way home too. And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.